For most of the past century, Israelis and Palestinians have been sworn enemies, locked in a seemingly endless war. From the outside, the battlefield seems black and white, two opposing sides facing off with zero common ground. But zoom in closer, and an unexpected front emerges, because between Israelis and Palestinians is a third group. These are the Arab citizens of Israel, who live with the foot in two opposing worlds, caught in a high-wire act over a field of landmines, deeply aware that both sides are scrutinizing their every move. But can you really be Israeli and Palestinian at the same time? Israel is the Jewish state, but it's also defined by its vibrant, chaotic mashup of different cultures and religions. Plenty of Israeli Jews grew up with Arabic in the home. I grew up watching my grandpa speak Arabic with friends from Jaffa and Abu Ghosh. When I was a kid, this seemed totally unremarkable. A fifth of the country is Arab after all. At the end of the day, we were all Israelis. And then I grew up and learned that things are a lot more complicated. Right across the de facto borders that separate Israel from the West Bank and Gaza are millions of Palestinians, many related by blood to the Arabs I knew in Israel. And though lots of people have hyphenated identities, things get complicated when the identities on either side of that hyphen are at war with one another. For many of the 2.1 million Arab citizens of Israel, that war is deeply personal. And as a Jewish Israeli who believes in the promises of a multicultural society, I wanted to know how Arab citizens navigate their paradoxical identities. So I turned to my friend Ibrahim Abu Ahmed, a peace activist who has been wrestling with this question for a long time. We met in his hometown of Nazareth, aka the Arab capital of Israel, the perfect place to untangle the question of what it means to be an Arab citizen of Israel. Nazareth has a long history, and in this region, history tends to dictate pretty much everything. For example, which side of the border you live on.
I guess it's a good time to say welcome to Nazareth.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for
Excited
coming.
to be here.
My family is originally from Nazareth. They've been in generations. But actually the story of Nazareth also is connected to 1948 and the Palestinian Nakba.
Right.
In terms of neighboring towns around Nazareth where people fled, where people were expelled and ran away. And so they came to Nazareth and rose the percentage of Muslim residents, and it became the majority rather than the Christian majority.
Right. That Nakba that Ibrahim mentioned is one of the defining events of the 20th century. It's the Arabic word for catastrophe and refers to the creation of the State of Israel and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. So why did so many Palestinians become refugees while others stayed within the borders of the Jewish state? To answer that question, we have to go back to November of 1947, when the United Nations voted to split Mandate Palestine into two states, one for Arabs, the other for Jews. Think of it as the original two-state solution. But the so-called partition plan didn't exactly pan out. So when the Jews of Palestine declared independence 6 months later, they had a sneaking suspicion that things were about to get chaotic. They were right. One day after the Israeli Declaration of Independence, 5 neighboring countries invaded, joining the Arab-Palestinian militias already on the ground. The war was fierce and bloody, and both Israelis and Palestinians paid a terrible price. Israel lost 1% of its population, with thousands more displaced. Most Arab Palestinians lost their homes. 700,000 people had fled or been expelled, creating a nation in exile. From across a border bristling with barbed wire, they crowded into squalid refugee camps, all the while dreaming of home. But that home was gone. Many Arab villages had become Israeli towns. Hebrew rang out in the market stalls. Streets were renamed after Jewish heroes. And as the surrounding Arab world spat out its Jews in rage and revenge, Israel's Jewish population more than doubled, reshaping the demographics of the state. For Israeli Jews, this was a national rebirth. After millennia of exile, they were finally back home, masters of their own destiny at last. For Palestinians, this was a catastrophe, an exile, a dispossession, a wound that would never close, the Nakba. But not every Palestinian became a refugee. 150,000 Palestinian Arabs had stayed in what was now Israel. From their front row seats, they watched Mandate Palestine transform into the Jewish state. In the catastrophe, they'd lost a national homeland, but they had also gained a country. But why did some Palestinians stay in a state built for and by Jews.
I remember talks with my grandfather. It's about survival, It's about, better to stay in our towns and villages than to become refugees. And we have some of our family that became refugees in 1948, and they're still refugees still today. So I don't think that the Arab political leadership had any strategy at the time other than just to live day by day and see if it works.
Mr. Daraushe has dedicated his life to Arab-Jewish coexistence in the State of Israel. His grandparents' choice to stay in 1948 set the course for the rest of his life. To a certain extent, that's true of all Arab citizens of Israel. But not everyone is given a choice whether to stay or go. If you ask Ibrahim, his status as an Israeli citizen is an accident of history, rather than the result of a calculated decision.
We're in the town of Turan, a village located in the north of Israel. That's my grandparents' house. In 1948, when the war broke out, and my great-grandfather went to fight in the war on the Palestinian side, and he was killed there. And my grandma, at the age of 7, lost her dad. So our grandparents, my grandma, and all her siblings tried to find somewhere to go, and they started marching north, try to get to Lebanon, far away from the clashes, far away from the war, and when things are better, we'll come back. On their way to Lebanon, they realized that Tehran raised the white flag, there was no more clashes in Tehran, and they were able to return. So they did a U-turn, came back here, saw so much destruction after they left, and things that happened to the house and to everything that they left behind. But the community was still there, so they resettled in their own community. My grandma was born in the West Bank, the area that today is known as the West Bank. If they stayed, today they would have been Palestinians in the West Bank, along with all their descendants. If they continued marching to Lebanon, their descendants, would have been Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. So our citizenship as the generations after was defined by where our grandparents ended up physically at one point in time in 1948. So our citizenship wasn't a decision. It was a circumstance, a geographic circumstance.
But these newly minted Arab citizens of Israel decided to make the best of those circumstances. After all, they'd survived the Ottoman Empire and British rule. Under the Israelis, they would finally have some say in the way that they were governed. Because when the Israeli Prime Minister declared independence, he promised all Palestinian Arabs who wished to be a part of the state full and equal citizenship. Mr. Daraushe's grandparents believed that promise.
They did believe the promise in the Declaration of Independence. They took it seriously. They guaranteed political and social equality, not just social equality, but also political equality.
But promises are one thing, reality is another. And the reality was that Jews and Arabs had very little reason to trust each other. They just fought a bitter existential war. The borders of the new state weren't borders at all, but highly porous armistice lines that led countless infiltrators through. Hundreds of Jewish Israelis lost their lives to these intruders. The war may have ended, but Israel was still surrounded by hostile neighbors. Would the 150,000 Arab citizens of Israel be loyal to their new state? Or were they an enemy from within? No one knew the answers to these questions, but the Israelis weren't going to take any chances. So the government developed some contradictory policies around its Arab citizens. On the one hand, Arab citizens had every right to vote and to run for political office. 3 Arabs served in the country's very first parliament. Just as it did for Jewish citizens, the government built infrastructure in Arab villages, paving roads, building schools, even launching Arabic language radio shows and newspapers. These efforts weren't entirely altruistic. Israeli officials were savvy enough to understand that the best way to quell a potential uprising was to make Arab citizens feel a part of the state. But it's difficult to feel a part of the state when you live under strict military law.
Arab citizens were put in some kind of containment situation between 1948 until 1966, in which Israel wasn't sure it wants to have Arab citizens or not. And they imposed the military administration to contain the Arab citizens and prevent them from integration in Israeli society. The leading theory then was that there might be an opportunity for population exchange between Israel and the Arab countries, that Israel will get rid of those leftovers of the Palestinians and instead get the Jews from Arab countries.
Of course, that never happened. The surrounding countries refused to recognize Israel's existence. So there were no deals, no population exchanges, no Palestinian state. Instead, 700,000 Palestinians lived in exile as 150,000 Arab citizens of Israel navigated their unexpected and often harsh status quo. They needed permits to travel outside their villages. Even if they got those permits, they risked being detained by the police or military. They couldn't hold political assemblies or fly a Palestinian flag. The smallest whiff of subversion, and they'd find themselves up close and personal with the Israeli authorities. But there was no mass uprising, no homegrown terror. The calls to lift the military rule grew louder and louder, from Arabs and Jews alike. It took 18 years, but in 1966, the last of the military laws was finally lifted, and Arab citizens of Israel were finally entirely equal under the law.
In the 1960s, they started, I think, developing something positive regarding Arab citizens. They started talking about using the terms coexistence.
But this coexistence came at a price. These citizens were caught between a state that distrusted them and an Arab world that saw them as traitors. Which might be one reason why most of Israel's Arab citizens more or less accepted the label Israeli Arabs, at least for the first 2 decades of the state. But identities, like people, don't stay static. In 1967, things became more complex. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan had been threatening war for months. So Israel brought the war to them. And in the process, they wrested control of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. For Israeli Jews, it was a shocking victory. For the Arab world, it was a Nakba, or setback. For Palestinians specifically, the war was complicated. It brought millions of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza under Israeli control. It also reconnected a people that had been split for 19 years. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Palestinian refugees could finally reunite with relatives who had stayed behind in Israel. It was a joyous reunion, a divided population rediscovering its other half.
We are one people, the people who are in Gaza, in West Bank, in the north, in the Galilee, in Nazareth, in wherever are. We are the Arabs who live in Israel or in Palestine, or in West Bank or in Gaza. We are the same Palestinian, the same people.
In general, we speak the same style, have the same humor, jokes, attitude, culture, food. So it's really easy to click because we come from very, very similar background.
But for all its joy, the new borders brought new complications. Today, fences, checkpoints, and walls separate Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. Back then, those barriers didn't exist. Everyone was going back and forth constantly. Palestinians in Gaza took day trips to Tel Aviv. Jewish Israelis shopped for cheap produce in West Bank market stalls. Arab citizens visited relatives they hadn't seen in years. There were no checkpoints, no fences, no soldiers with guns guarding the borders. Just people, mingling and influencing one another, for better and for worse. The Palestine Liberation Organization really stepped up its game in 1968. Their chosen method of liberating Palestine was attacking Israel and Israelis, whether at the Olympics, in schools, or even midair. For most Jewish Israelis, the PLO were public enemy number 1. But when the PLO flooded Arab towns with propaganda, some young Arab citizens joined the fight against Israel. By the late 80s, some Arab citizens had set up a roaring weapons trade between Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Others vandalized property or attacked Jews directly. There's a bitter irony in all of this. Until 1966, Arab citizens had been treated as a potential fifth column, guilty until proven innocent. By the late 80s, this tiny but violent fringe began to confirm some Israeli Jews' darkest fears about their Arab neighbors. It takes so much to build trust, so little to shatter it. Ibrahim knows that firsthand. He was a kid when the Israeli government and the PLO finally agreed to recognize one another. Like all citizens of Israel, he was glued to the TV to watch the PLO chairman and the Israeli prime minister shake hands on the White House lawn. He remembers the wild hope that consumed his city, as well as the promises that went up in smoke.
And there was a euphoric feeling in the 1990s. I remember going to kindergarten and having, the teachers ask us to draw pictures of doves and writing the words salam, shalom, and peace in all languages. People really believed that something great is about to happen. 2/3 of the Israeli society at the time believed in two-state solution because it included us. Our community was, I think at the time it was about 80% or more that believed in two states.
The Oslo Accords were supposed to pave the way towards a Palestinian state. They created a Palestinian government in the West Bank and Gaza, giving Palestinians some measure of autonomy for the first time in their history. But they had another unexpected result. They allowed Arab citizens of Israel to fully and publicly explore their identities, to decide for themselves whether they were Israeli or Palestinian, or somewhere in between, to figure out if and how those different layers of their identity could exist in harmony. In other words, Oslo forced our question out into the open. Can you really be Israeli and Palestinian at the same time?
So 2/3 of Arab citizens say they're Palestinians. If you would have asked that in the 80s, you probably would get 30%. So this more than doubled over the last 40 years, mainly as a result of legitimization of the Palestinian identity after Oslo agreements.
Oslo made it okay to identify, at least in part, as Palestinian. And for many, this was a no-brainer. Of course they were Palestinian.
يعني الثقافة الفلسطينية طبعا من مئات السنين موجودة احنا قريبنا اخوالي طبعا انا بهاي الدولة مش معي الباسبور الاسرائيلي بس احنا يعني الحمد لله انه اهالينا ما هجوش وضلينا وحافظنا على ارضنا وعرضنا ولغتنا.
For some, their Palestinian identity is exclusive. They are Palestinian. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing else, even if they live in Israel.
I have a really surprising identity actually. I am Palestinian.
Are you Israeli?
I mean, other than the piece of paper that I carry, I don't feel that it includes me.
Yeah.
The flag does not include me, does not represent me. The thing is what the word Israel today in politics represents.
Yeah.
As Palestinians, you associate the word Israeli with the occupation, with the killing of your own people, and all of the different ways of oppression. So I cannot be on the same side, under the same umbrella, under the same name that is used to oppress my people.
This is where two narratives collide, where Jewish Israelis talk about rebirth, about return, about the justice of Zionism, and where Arab citizens see their continued dispossession, their replacement, their oppression. And when you frame it this way, of course these identities can only be one or the other, zero sum, the return of one people automatically dispossessing another. But in my experience, most Arab citizens of Israel don't feel this way. Or rather, they don't feel this way entirely. It's more complicated, more nuanced. So I asked Ibrahim how he thought about it, whether his identity feels zero sum.
I would say that we live on a spectrum, and a spectrum that has two outliers. On one side, you have somebody who sees themselves as an Israeli, just Israeli, an Arab Israeli. And that person has no personal connotation or feeling of connection to Palestinian peoplehood, or the Palestinian people, or the Palestinian conflict, or the Palestinian struggle. On the other side of the spectrum, you have someone who sees themselves as only Palestinian. And if the state is wiped and disappear tomorrow morning, great. If not, it's the reality. But the vast majority of the people of our community are not on these outliers, these polarized outliers. They actually live on the spectrum somewhere. And your position on the spectrum is not static. It changes throughout your life. It changes with experiences, with growing up, and also with things that are happening on the ground.
Outliers exist. Outliers are valid. But they're not the majority. Sharif is on one end of the pole. Ali is on another. Ali is a high school teacher and an officer in IDF. And I kind of wish I could put him in a room with Sharif and watch them talk. Because while they are both Arab citizens of Israel, there's almost no common ground in the way they define themselves.
الكل بيعرف إحنا مواطني دولة إسرائيل. لنا هوية واحدة وهي الهوية الإسرائيلية، وأنت إسرائيلي لكل شيء. تحمل هوية دولة إسرائيل وعلمك وعلم إسرائيل، ومؤسساتك الحكومية والمدنية هي مؤسسات إسرائيلية، وأنت دائما بتروح عليها. كيف ممكن أنت بهذا الواقع بدك تخلط أخرى واقع آخر؟ بدك تدخل على هذا الواقع أخرى واقع آخر اللي يشتت من تفكيرك ويشتت من طموحاتك، ومش بس كمان مش راح توصل للي بدك إياه.
For a lot of Jewish Israelis, Ali's narrative is so enticing because it doesn't ask us to look inside ourselves. It doesn't ask us to consider that maybe things are more complicated. Instead, it's reassuring. We're all Israeli. We're all in this together. We're all doing just fine. And maybe, in some senses, that's true. Maybe for some people that feels true. But it's not a common sentiment. Because the state isn't just one thing. There are good parts and there are bad parts. And then there are parts that can't be slotted so neatly into a binary.
Most people say this is a zero-sum game. How can you be both Palestinian and Israeli? Well, this creature called the Arab citizens of Israel thinks it can be.
So when I met Zohri Azab, I asked her what she thought. And her answer tracked with what Ibrahim and Dr. Darawshe told me. It's a spectrum. Neither all one thing or all the other.
أنا بعرفش غير حالي هويتي إسرائيلية. يعني أنا خلقت مع هاي الهوية. بس بعرف إنه أنا من يوم ما أنا خلقت طبعاً إحنا فلسطينية. إحنا فلسطينية في الأساس. أنا أمي وأبوي خلقوا قبل دولة إسرائيل. وعاشوا النكبة. ونقلوا إلنا بحذافيرها كل قصة اللجوء.
Zohria's experience of Israeliness is also an experience of being an outsider. Yes, she's an Israeli in many senses, but not necessarily in a full one.
أنا بحمل هوية إسرائيلية مثل أي حدا ثاني، بس أنا مختلفة. يعني الدولة بمضمونها بتعريفها هي كمان هي أصلاً معرفة دولة اليهود. تستثنيني أنا كأصل كقومية. الهوية اليهودية بهاي الدولة هي بتعطي أفضلية لحاملها. يعني بمجرد إنك أنت خلقت يهودي أنت أفضل، أنت عندك أفضليات عني أنا كأقلية عربية. فيش شك إنه التمييز العنصري اللي تمارس وبعده يمارس ضد الأقلية العربية هي رجعتهن أكثر لجذورهن الفلسطينية.
These are difficult words to hear for a Jewish Israeli who wants to believe that the state is as democratic as its Declaration of Independence promised. But a democratic country shouldn't shy away from difficult truths, even ugly ones. Step one of being a democracy is hearing what our fellow citizens are telling us. Step two is doing something about it, or at least trying to understand what we can do, because there is a lot to do.
مش إذا أنت حكيتي عربي الكل بتلفخ عليكي، وإذا أنت طلعتي مثلا محجبة طوالي صورتي إشي ثاني. هون أنت لمجرد إنك طلعت من بلدك من محيط بلدك تبعد 3-4 كيلومتر بتصير غريب. الغربة ببلدك إشي كثير صعب.
I can imagine that. I've felt that in different ways, to different extents. But the underlying feeling of alienation and exclusion was the same. Because I'm a Jew of color, and while there are certain niches where I felt totally comfortable and at ease, I've also heard firsthand how people talk about Jews when they don't know that there's a Jew in the room. I've been harassed by the police just for having the wrong skin tone in the wrong neighborhood. So I feel deeply sympathetic to Zohria's experience, particularly after October 7th. Because every single Israeli citizen, no matter their background, was jolted by Hamas's attack on October 7th. For some, the spectrum disappeared entirely. If they didn't feel Israeli before, they were absolutely Israeli now. The popular YouTuber Nas Daily released a statement on social media rebranding himself not as a Palestinian Israeli, but as an Israeli Palestinian, with his Israeliness coming first and foremost. But Ibrahim disagrees. He says Hamas's actions don't represent or diminish his Palestinian identity. And Mr. Darawshe agrees with him.
People try to distance themselves very quickly from the Hamas's actions on October 7th. And I heard many people saying, this can't be done in our name as Muslims, this can't be done in our name as Palestinians. This is too savage for our Arab values and culture. And actually there was a study by the Hebrew University that showed that 70% of Arab citizens said that their sense of Israeliness has increased after October 7th.
In the immediate aftermath of the attack, the news replayed the nightmare footage on loop. More and more survivors and first responders came forward with their stories, including Arab citizens of Israel who wanted to tell their own stories of being targeted, of running towards the fire instead of away. After all, Hamas didn't discriminate between Arabs and Jews. They didn't ask if their victims served in the military or who they voted for or what they believed. They didn't care if you were just a kid with your whole life ahead of you.
Our relative Awad was a 23-year-old paramedic that worked at the Nova party. He refused to evacuate the scene after the attack. They told him it's dangerous, you need to leave. And his choice was no. He said to them, I speak Arabic, I think I'm going to manage. For us in the family, this was a very traumatic event, but also a source of pride of his action. He chose to sacrifice himself for his humanity. For us, he died as a hero, fulfilling the values that we believe in.
But as the war has dragged on, Gaza lies in ruins. Many Israeli citizens, Arab and Jewish alike, have called for the war to end. And they are paying for it, particularly Arab citizens. When Mr. Daraush's daughter posted on social media about the devastation of Gaza, she got a surprise visit from the authorities.
She was arrested as a suspicion for support of a terror organization. And they put her on house arrest for 5 days, expulsion from college for 2 weeks. And now they want to close the file based on lack of evidence, which we refuse, because there was no crime. So close the file based on lack of crime.
Both Jews and Arabs have used social media to inflame tensions. But few Jewish Israelis have faced the same repercussions as Arab citizens, like Mr. Daraush's daughter. And that's because there is still a gulf between Arabs and Jews in Israel. Ordinary people like Mr. Daraush and Ibrahim are working hard to bridge that gulf. But those bridges are delicate and frail. But that work is essential for all of Israel's citizens and for Israel's future.
I know that the Jews are the minority in the Middle East, and that's why you need friends. We are your potential best friend in the region. You need us to prove to the rest of the Arab world that Jews and Arabs can live together. If you can't prove it on your home base on square one, why should someone in Saudi Arabia believe that you mean well? If you prove that Jews and Arabs can live together, this is Israel's best export to the Arab world.
But what would an equal partnership look like in which both Jewish and Arab citizens find themselves on equal footing in their shared country? Ibrahim believes that progress will come only when Jews and Palestinians recognize that their fates are bound together.
There's no Palestinian liberation without Israeli security, but at the same time, there's no Israeli security without Palestinian liberation. These two things have to come together. Yeah. If you get one, you get the other, and vice versa. Yeah. And only with looking at those two things as interchangeable, we can see, moving ahead.
It's a major shift in mindset, and it's going to take time and effort from everyone. Full acceptance and integration might not happen in my lifetime, but as the rabbis tell us in the Ethics of the Fathers, that Jewish book of wisdom compiled nearly 2,000 years ago, it's not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it.